obviously you know me. I'm Dominic Cotton. I'm currently running for Board of Aldermen in Milford, and I'm taking the opportunity to go around and meet with our voters. For tonight's guest, we have somebody who was running for Secretary of State, true to his word. When our current Secretary of State decided that she was going to run again, he actually pulled out. But I have a gentleman that's very knowledgeable about voting and the importance of voting, and really in this world, I think this is your one opportunity to have a voice, whether it's local, state, or federal, to be able to speak out. So I am glad to have Representative Lesser from the 100th in Middletown on today.
Yep. Thank you for having me.
So I know Secretary of State. I know that they register businesses, but most important are what the Secretary of State does for voting. So what exactly are the responsibilities of a Secretary of State?
Well, the Secretary of State has a whole grab bag of different responsibilities, including keeping track of new laws and all regulations passed by state agencies. As you mentioned, every time you want to start a new business in the state of Connecticut, you have to file with the Secretary of State in most cases. And then there's the function that you mentioned, which is overseeing, being the chief democracy officer of the state of Connecticut, making sure that our elections operate, overseeing local and state elections in a variety of different respects, tabulating results. I think in the last few years, we've seen just a growing appreciation for democracy, how we can't take it for granted, how other countries don't have it, and how it's under assault, not just around the world, but sometimes here at home.
Well, now I know there was a big push in this last year after what happened with the Electoral College to go from Electoral College, which I guess is more almost making our national offices a state-by-state election, to going to a national popular vote. I guess, what would be the advantages of moving from an electoral college to a national sort of popular vote?
So what you're talking about is a bill that I introduced in Connecticut that mirrors bills that were passed in a number of other states, including California and New York and many of states around the country, which would be to switch the way we allocate our votes in Connecticut, our electoral college votes, to the winner of the national popular vote. That would only kick into effect when half of the country is signed on, so enough to actually affect the election. Otherwise, we're just throwing away our votes. And the idea is very simple, that when we think about democracy, when we think about how elections are supposed to work, we say that the person who gets the most votes is supposed to win. That's how we think about democracy. That's what gives democracy its legitimacy, right? It's that the person who's there has been chosen by the majority of the people. We do it for governor, we do it for state senate, we do it for aldermen in the town of Milford, we do it all over the place. The one place we don't do it is in the president. And so what I think you find, and I think if you got Donald Trump speaking candidly, he would tell you that he thinks if his job had been to get the most votes, he could have done so. And maybe he's right. But I think what happens is when you have a president who's not gotten the most votes, and in the last election, 3 million more people voted for Hillary Clinton than voted for Donald Trump. That really makes it harder to be president. It undercuts the legitimacy of the presidency. It makes the president always look in their rearview mirror, because I think when you're trying to govern, you have enormous soft power, this idea that you have the will of the people behind you. And I think that is essential to allowing a president to do his job. And I think Donald Trump's job has been made more difficult by not having that popular mandate. Now, there's a second issue that I think is important for us here in Connecticut, which is we've got a whole series of problems in this state. We've got concerns. We've got economic hardships. We've got our own local issues, whether it's from revitalizing the valley or making sure that we have our financial sector doing well, our insurance companies are doing well, our ports are back in operation. We've got a whole set of issues here. And to be honest, presidential candidates couldn't care less. And the reason they don't have to care about it is because they don't have to campaign here. Connecticut has traditionally been a Democratic state in presidential elections, and so presidential candidates ignore it, but for both parties, they spend their time in the real swing states. So when you look at where federal money goes, it goes to places like Ohio, it goes to places like Pennsylvania that are real swing states, and it doesn't go here. And what presidential candidates are campaigning on and talking about aren't Connecticut issues. You know, Connecticut is a state that does a huge amount of exporting. We export jet engines made in my district in Middletown to Europe. We don't talk about American exports on the presidential campaign, right? That's not an issue that really resonates with voters in Ohio and Iowa. And as a result, the issues that matter to Connecticut residents are just not talked about. And so I think we lose twice. One, you have occasionally you have an election where the guy who gets the most votes or the woman who gets the most votes isn't elected, and so then you've got this legitimacy question. And then you've got the issue that what matters to Connecticut is ignored. And then there's the third issue, and I'll just sort of just mention it, which is that when you talk to broadcasters in Connecticut, they're losing out because presidential campaigns right now spend a ton of money. They raise a lot of money, they spend a lot of money, and that money is not coming to Connecticut; it's going to the other places. And so they're not buying ads, they're not, and that actually hurts the economy. I mean, I think in the 2012 election, both candidates, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, together spent a combined total of $100 in Connecticut in the general election. Wow. And that was an election that I think the total spending was like $2 billion.
Well, now, I guess one of the other things that this would take away would probably be the whole idea behind gerrymandering. I guess, what is gerrymandering? I mean,
sure. So gerrymandering is this idea that politicians, instead of the voters choosing the politicians choose their voters, right? They draw their own districts in state legislatures and for Congress in order to make sure that the person they want to elect wins and that their party gets as many seats as possible. Some states do it where whatever party's in control gets to draw the districts however they like. Most states do it that way. Connecticut's a little bit different. We have a bipartisan process where Democratic and Republican leaders get in a room and they draw districts, and usually what they do is they both agree to protect their incumbents. And I think that there's something fundamentally wrong about that. The Supreme Court is actually looking at the issue of gerrymandering right now. Because what you get is a Congress where members of Congress don't really have to care about what the majority of people in this country think because their districts are drawn using modern technology, computers, to make sure that you can pack as many people who agree with them into the district as possible, and they don't have to face a challenge. And so what it does is it pushes candidates to be more extreme. It makes Congress not representative of the majority of the people in the country. It's a real threat to democracy in this country. A couple of states have done some really interesting things about it. Arizona and California both have created, instead of bipartisan systems the way Connecticut does, they've moved to a nonpartisan independent commission with just ordinary citizens, drawing districts that try to keep communities whole and that try to make sure that there's as much competition as possible. I got elected in 2008. I defeated a longtime incumbent. I'm a Democrat, and I defeated a longtime Republican incumbent. And because the district was drawn in a way that could go either way, it made me and my opponents knock on every single door. We really had to work our tails off in order to get elected, and had to talk to every single voter in the district, and I had to do it every single year, and including years where I wasn't on the ballot, because if I didn't do that, I would lose. And I think that made me a better elected official and made me responsive to what people actually cared about, not what I thought they cared about. And I wish that were something that everybody who ran for office had to do.
Well, I know mine is, as you say, it's a swing district. It can go either way. It has gone back and forth over time. I know that we have primaries tomorrow. I know this is going to air after the primaries. But I guess that's, when you look at Congress, that's probably one of the biggest issues about pushing people over to the left or to the right, is you have the threat of people coming and primarying you from your own party for your views. And there's not that, as you said, there's not that swing states. There's not as many of those as there once were because of this whole process. And you know what? I'm out there. I'm knocking on all kinds of doors right at the moment, and it is the best way that you get a feel for your community. I've figured out streets in Milford that I never knew
Exactly.
really existed, because they're a little bit off the beaten path. And although we're one larger community, there are some specific issues in different neighborhoods that if you didn't have to go knock those doors, or if you didn't go meet those people, you would be denying them part of their voice. And part of their voice is, coming up and being able to vote and vote for somebody that they feel is actually going to represent them, whether it's their views or really I call it customer service, because when you're an elected official, you're providing a customer service. You're there for your constituents, and it doesn't matter whether they got a D, an R, or more than likely in where we are, they're unaffiliated. You still have to help people no matter what.
And the thing we have to understand is that there are a ton of people out there, and some of them voted for Donald Trump in the last election, some of them voted for Bernie Sanders, but there are a ton of people out there, and some of them stayed home, but there are a ton of people out there who don't feel like politicians have any idea how they're living their lives. They feel disillusioned. They feel that nobody cares. And there is no better way to send a message that people do care than to knock on their door, and to listen to them, and to make sure that you're actually responding to asking them what they care about, and how whether government, whether it's at the local, state, federal level, can make their lives better. I think that idea of listening to ordinary people, to regular people, to getting out there into the community and being responsive is essential to our democracy functioning. And the problem is that in too many places, you don't have to do anything to get elected. You just simply have to have the support of your party leaders, and that has, I think, created this distance that doesn't need to be there between elected officials and the people that they were elected to represent.
I certainly see that, and I know in Bridgeport, because I'm closer to it, I see that is a major issue. And you know what? To people's credit, they have gone and they're doing what they should be doing. If you don't like the form of government that you have, or if you feel like it's taken over in that way, they go out and they primary people, and they go to and have debates, and they point these things out. And I think this is what makes our system a lot better, is the amount of social media that's out there, because now it's not just a debate in front of like 20 or 30 people. It can be put out there for everybody to be able to see, and what's like what we do with this show is, we give people access to information, and this makes like the civics of everything so much better in our world.
Yeah, no, I used to be, when I not in ancient times, when I was first elected, the main way I would communicate with constituents was through the print media, right? I'd have to talk to a reporter, and they would decide whether or not it would get published. They would talk to their editor, then they would have to write an article, which may or may not capture things. And now with social media, you go on my Facebook page and you see my Twitter feed. It's people telling me, hey, I really like this thing you did. Oh, hey, this thing you did is really stupid. But you have that productive back and forth where people feel like they're connected to me, and they are. And I'll respond to folks, and sometimes we'll agree, and sometimes we won't. But I think it's really so important. I mean, we can talk about the big policy disputes, the big policy issues, but for people to feel represented, that there's somebody out there who works for them, who listens to them, who's responsive, and I think good legislators are doing that now in a way that we weren't able to do a few years ago before that technology was there.
It's a benefit to us all. It really is. Now, going on to some of these things, because I look at you, and I know you're head of banking committee, and I know something that you're big about is consumers' rights. And I know from across the board, and I guess there's some legislation that passed as far as civil forfeiture. So if somebody gets arrested, and previously, I guess the police could seize your property. I guess how is that bill working now?
So this is something called civil asset forfeiture reform, which we were able to pass this year. And amazingly, a few states have taken this on. Connecticut's the first state to do this unanimously, bipartisan basis. And I think that's important because we see a lot, we hear a lot on the news where Democrats are calling Republicans bad names and vice versa. And I don't think we get enough attention for when we're working together, when the system is actually working the way it should, and we're solving problems on a bipartisan basis. But the idea is, and this is, I think, an important concept, is when someone has committed a crime, and there are proceeds or assets related to that crime, let's say you're a drug dealer and you've made a lot of money selling drugs, that the proceeds related to that crime can be seized by the state. And that's something that's pretty non-controversial. If you've committed fraud, you don't get to keep the money you've stolen from your employer. So the question, though, is how you do that. And typically what happens in many cases is you were arrested for a crime, and the police suspect that the cash you have on you or your car is related to your criminal activity. They seize the asset. But under prior law, the burden on the police and on prosecutors to take that property was less than the burden of beyond a reasonable doubt. So you could have a situation where somebody is found not guilty of being a drug dealer, and yet that money is still taken because, at the same time, the judicial system is saying you're not a drug dealer. They're still taking your property anyway, and that was I thought was really concerning. And so the idea of making sure that people who have committed crimes lose their property is not controversial. But in some cases, you saw people who were found not guilty, charges were dropped, they were acquitted, and yet their property was still being taken by police and prosecutors. So the law that we passed was very simple. It says if you're found not guilty, you get your stuff back. It's really pretty self-evident to me. And that property goes to fund local police departments, it goes to fund the prosecutors, and some of it goes to compensate victims. It's a special victims compensation fund we have there. And so that continues as is, but you have to actually be convicted of the crime that you were convicted of, or accused of.
It makes sense. You know what? I know this isn't in Connecticut, but I certainly, if you look at politics, around the country, I have, I guess, a distinct distress about monetizing the legal system, the jail system, and many of these others, because I think it lends itself to people's rights being taken away because of the money that people make, or people staying in jails for longer periods of time than necessary because it's an industry, and I think that one of the most important things that we can do is in civil society is to realize that there are certain functions of government which should remain that way and shouldn't be privatized, so that these opportunities along those lines are kind of laid out there. Like I said, I don't see this in so much in Connecticut, although at one point we were sending inmates out to other states that did have this. I'm glad that we as a state, perform these activities, and they are part of state government, and they're overseen in that.
Yeah, and this was an interesting issue because it brought together people who came from different perspectives, but all looked at this as a common sense issue. So we had civil libertarians who were concerned about people's rights. We also had regular old libertarians who were concerned about the power of big government. And you had this sort of left-right coalition of folks who said, this doesn't make a lot of sense, but we can change the incentives a little bit. We can make sure that people's rights are protected, but we found a way to do it without changing the way police have to go out and do their jobs, because this is really what happens in the court system after somebody's been arrested, after property's been seized, and the police can do their jobs without having to worry about major changes. And we were looking at initially at some broader changes. Right now, the money that's seized does go to fund the local police, and so people have raised questions that there's an incentive that's created in some cases for more stops because, hey, that generates revenue. I don't know if that's true or not. We didn't tackle that in this bill. We just simply focused on whether you get your stuff back or not, and when that happens.
And I know another big one that affects poor communities is some of the bail reform that came about this session. I guess, can you speak a little towards that?
Yeah, I mean, we've been trying to figure out ways to reform the bail system, make sure that, if I commit a crime, I'm arrested, and some other person who's desperately poor commits a crime, that we're treated more or less the same way. And unfortunately, you've had cases where people have been left in jail for long periods of time because they don't even have nominal amounts of money. So there is this whole industry out there, the bail industry. I think the United States is the only country in the world that has anything like it. I don't think. I think we're sort of unique there, and so we passed some bail reforms this year to try to make it easier for people to get out of jail. I don't have the specifics of the legislation on me right now, but I think the idea is to ensure that people who have aren't left in jail for extended periods of time if they can't come up with a modest amount of money.
And I think for everybody out there to realize that part of the reason that this is being put forward, obviously, is not just for civil rights. It's for cost savings. To have somebody in the jail system costs somewhere upwards of $50,000 a year.
No.
So to have somebody stay in for an extended period of time, which is literally over like $4,500 a month, because they can't come up with bail for $500 worth of bail because they don't have the money or they don't have the assets to be able to put up. It doesn't make sense on a fairness side. It's keeping poor people within the system, and they would never be able to make the money to be able to do that.
Yeah, it's fiscally irresponsible. It also there's the equity issue, right? And so two people have committed the same crime. One of them is poorer than the other, and then of course people lose their jobs, right? You can't show up for work. You can't get you get fired from your job, and so there have been all of these horror stories of people who are poor, but they're working, they have a job, and they get terminated because they can't show up for work. And maybe the employer is willing to give them a day or two, but if sometimes people are out for several days, for weeks, in some cases for months, for tiny amounts of money just because they can't afford bail. Typically these small bail amounts are for relatively minor offenses. Nobody wants a mass murderer walking free.
No.
We're talking about people who've committed relatively minor or been accused of relatively minor offenses. If I have $100 in my pocket or $500 I can get from my ATM, and somebody else doesn't, I'm walking free, and they're not, and just simply for that arbitrary reason.
Now, I know in banking committee, maybe not this year, but I know in prior years, because you've been the chair for
3 years now.
For 3 years now. I know, although it doesn't seem to be as big of a story now because some of our economics have come back to a certain degree. But I still think it's an unheard story about people going underwater on their mortgages. And I know that you put forth certain legislation in order to be able to help people deal with that.
Yeah. So we have done some really radical things in Connecticut. I think, first of all, you're right that the news media talks about an issue and then they move on, and they don't do the follow-ups. And actually, when you look at Connecticut, you've seen that foreclosures have continued. They're down from their high at the height of the financial crisis. But first of all, there's always a lag, right? So once people go into financial distress, they don't immediately get foreclosed on. That there's a lag of sometimes a few years, but then also that we're still not down to a baseline level. We're still, and even when we are at a baseline level, people are still getting foreclosed on because they've made whatever financial decisions or things have happened. So pushed a policy to try to make sure that we can keep as many people as possible in their homes. That's the policy of the state of Connecticut. But that when that doesn't make sense, that we find ways for people to move on with their lives in a way that's respectful, that takes their rights into account. So we have a few different tools that we've given folks. One is we have a process that's called foreclosure mediation, where anybody who is getting foreclosed on has a right to sit down and talk to their bank. And I know that sounds sort of self-evident, sort of obvious. It is actually a hugely controversial area. The banks don't like to do it. It takes an enormous amount of time on their end. They say, look, we would like to just get these things through as quickly as possible. And we say, no, hold on, you have to press pause. You have to talk to homeowners. And there's no obligation on banks to make a deal. They can just play for time if they want. But it works, actually. Just getting the bank to the table resolves foreclosures in the vast majority of cases, because either homeowners are able to work out a deal, or they're able to reach some sort of accommodation where maybe they hand over the keys to the house and everybody is happy and it doesn't further screw up their credit. But there's some sort of deal that works out for everyone. In the vast majority of cases, simply by when you get the bank to sit down and have that conversation. Then we also have some programs that help people. We've got something called emergency mortgage assistance, which you can get and can help modify a mortgage and make it more affordable, and that's a state-funded program. And then we also became the first state, passed this law last year, became the first state to allow judges, in some rare cases when you're underwater in your home, to tell some of your creditors that simply there's not enough money there, and that they're just not going to be able to get all of their money, and that can sometimes free up a mortgage modification. So if you're underwater and you're trying to modify your mortgage, you literally need to get every single creditor that you have to agree to a deal. And a lot of times there are folks who have relatively small claims. Let's say you've got a $500 lien on a property. You may be way down the pecking order, but if you hold up the deal, you can sometimes the bank will sometimes just write you a $10,000 check to go away and let the deal go through. Unfortunately, sometimes what that means is that even when everybody agrees to allow a short sale or a mortgage modification, that homeowners are forced into foreclosure, they lose their homes, everybody gets hurt. And so we really did something that was radical by saying that in some cases where it's clear that the bank, that the creditor is not going to get their money, a judge can tell them to go take a hike if they're hurting the system as a whole. So we'll see if that helps people. My hope is it does, and we'll continue to find more ways to try to help homeowners through it.
And I know one of the things that I faced this weekend when I was going and knocking doors was I talked to a lady, and she was telling me, and this has to do with student loans, because obviously this is in the same sort of category. She signed up with one of these online universities to get her nursing degree. It was an unsavory organization that loaned her the money for them to be paid, and she continues to pay on this because she has to get loans for her daughter that's going to Ohio State, and she doesn't want to screw up her credit.
No.
And I'm going, oh my God. I mean, because that's just like, such a she said that the place wasn't accredited. They said they were supposed to be associated with these universities or other things, and they weren't. And they're holding her credit hostage.
Yeah.
Now, is there anything along those lines that came in any bills?
Yeah. So actually, that's a huge issue of mine. I wrote something called the Student Loan Bill of Rights, and the idea was that because the federal government isn't doing their job of regulating the loan industry, that the states really have to step up and do this. So we became the first state. We were the first state to pass on to do a student loan bill of rights and require student loan companies to be licensed by the state of Connecticut, and they have to adhere to basic consumer protections. They have to meet standards, and if they don't, you can call the Department of Banking up. You can file a complaint. You can take away their, and in theory, we can do everything up until taking away their right to do business in the state of Connecticut to operate. In addition to that, our Attorney General, George Jepson, has been aggressive in going after some of these bad actors. But yeah, I've heard a lot of horror stories about people who go get degrees from unlicensed universities or universities that say you can do X in Connecticut, but you really can't. They've committed fraud in one way or the other. And one of the things, unfortunately, that this administration in Washington has really walked back are some of the defenses to repayment, because a lot of the funding is actually, I don't know if in this case whether the resident got a federal loan or not, but for federal student loans, the previous administration created a defense to repayment of fraud, where if you're at a school that has misled you, has sold you a bill of goods, you can use that as an argument for why you shouldn't have to pay back the student loans that they tricked you into taking. That's what they did for a number of the recent schools that were shut down by the federal government for fraud. And it's something that will really help a lot of people, because you're doubly hurt. One, you've wasted time and effort and money, and then you're trapped beyond that by this cloud of debt. I mean, the overall impact of student debt is now something like $1.3 trillion. And you can map out the impact of that. And actually, a lot of times, it's the people who have the large amounts of debt, the $100,000, the $200,000 dollars in debt we hear about. But most of the time, they're fine, right? They've gotten MBAs or JDs or MDs, and they're making a lot of money, and they're going to be living under that cloud for a while, but they'll get through it. But the folks who've borrowed $5,000 or $10,000 or 15 or 20, and then either dropped out of college, or they've gone to a for-profit that doesn't give them marketable skills, or they go to, in this case, a case where they've been defrauded, basically, sold a degree that doesn't have any actual value. Those folks are really hurt, because there you've gotten the debt, but you have no earning power to pay back the debt that you've accrued. And student debt is kind of unique, because if you borrow a home, you can go through foreclosure and then you wipe out the debt. If you take out credit cards that are way beyond your means, you can declare bankruptcy, and that'll hurt your credit rating. It'll stop you from doing a lot of things, but you can get beyond it. But student debt is the only kind of debt in this country that you can't escape through bankruptcy.
Kind of scary. And I know for me, I mean, I got my degree back in the early 90s. The price of a school, I don't think what I paid for my whole education, which was about $8,500, would get you through one semester in a lot of places. And even I have a graduate degree. Fortunate enough, it only cost me about $12,000. But the skyrocketing amount of money that goes into universities is just and in hand. I mean, it is part of the American dream. Yeah. It's everybody wants their kid to go off to school, go get a good job afterwards, and I think a lot of it, for a lot of people, it's prolonging them from being able to move forward with their lives and getting married and also buying homes and other things along those
starting
lines.
A business. Yeah, if you need to pay your student loan payment every month, right? You can't. You've got a job that you may not love, and you've got an idea to start a great business. Oftentimes you can't afford to take the risk of starting a business because you need to make that student loan payment every single month. And so I think it's having an effect on entrepreneurship. We want young people to take risks, to start businesses, to found the next Google or Facebook in Connecticut. That would be huge for our economy. But if you're out living under this cloud of debt, it's more difficult. I still think that college is a good bargain. I think we want people to go to college. It's disturbing that a few years ago, 20 years ago, the U.S. was number one in the world in terms of college attendance, and now we've fallen way down in the pack. And I think that will be a problem. It's not for everyone. There are great trades that people can get. A lot of Connecticut businesses are desperate to hire skilled tradespeople. Pratt & Whitney Electric Boat, but overall, college is still a good deal. But you have to really pay attention to the sticker price and to understand, the level of debt that you're getting into, and find ways to do it more effectively.
Well, I think that's one of the good things I know that a lot of community colleges have worked towards is working with the high-tech manufacturers, because the reality is we're not going to go backwards in time to a day when you were cranking out steel and you had good coal jobs and steel factory jobs. It's a lot of advanced manufacturing that's out there, and it takes more skill and more to be able to run the computers, to be able to produce the items that we can be able to go and sell at a high level profit. So I think that's something that we've started to develop and made steps towards, even with our technical schools, to creating that. I know, you have big manufacturing as far as that goes in Middletown too.
No, absolutely, and I think oftentimes we sort of have looked down our. In the state of Connecticut has looked down our noses at vocational technical schools and at our community colleges, and actually, really, they're essential to our ability to compete for jobs. Pratt & Whitney right now is staring at $1 trillion back order, and after years of not hiring folks, they recognize that, oh wow, we really do need to hire a ton of people in Connecticut in order to meet the demand that we've seen from our customer base. And so now they're sort of desperate to find folks. And so that means we need apprenticeship programs, we need tech schools to work, we need advanced manufacturing centers at our community colleges. The tough part right now, and looking at the state's long-term sort of budget needs, is making sure that we have the funding we need to make sure that those programs continue to exist and can actually scale up to meet that demand. Otherwise, factories will move to where the workers are. If they can't get them here, they'll find them somewhere else.
I think that kind of points out like another big thing. I guess that things are changing as far as where people want to locate themselves. And I know a couple of years ago the big thing was GE, and GE's moving their headquarters to Boston. And people are saying, well, that was, over like tax incentives and taxes. And a lot of it has nothing to do with that. A lot of it is where people are attracted to working.
No, I don't think GE. I don't think GE saved a nickel in taxes. I think they probably are paying more taxes in Boston than they were if GE moved to Boston to avoid taxes, they're the first company in history to move to Boston for its low tax environment. No, they moved there for. They said they put out a press release where they said why they were doing it. And it was because it's easier to hire like smart graduates of the Harvard Business School in Boston than it is in Fairfield, because I don't know, young people want to live in cities. They mentioned colleges and universities in Greater Boston. They mentioned the hub of other activity there. It used to be that Connecticut could attract businesses simply by being a safe set of suburbs when people were afraid to live in New York and Boston, when there was a lot of urban crime and there were a lot of quality of life issues. You think of New York in the 70s. Since the 90s, that's not really been the case. People move back to cities. Cities are trendy. We got to figure out what else we're going to do. We still have a lower tax rate than our surrounding states, but that's no longer enough to attract businesses. That and good schools and safe communities are important, but we need to do something else because we're losing our competitive edge.
We need to develop our cities, and I mean that's two sides of an equation. That's also better education for communities in the cities. Better funding for a lot of them because they're the centers that are going to retain. And if I look at New Haven, and I think of many of the biopharma industries that have like moved into downtown New Haven, or these kind of hubs that are interconnected with our school system. I mean, obviously you've got Yale right there. Yeah. And Quinnipiac and other places, but it's you have to, when you help to create these sectors, you have to figure out ways to be able to support them.
Yeah, and we have to find a way to make sure we have thriving small cities. We're never going to have a New York or a Boston, but I live in a city, Middletown, where we've been able to attract a large number of young people, startup businesses, capital, by really focusing on being a livable community where people want to be, where people have fun, and where the schools are good enough, and people really feel like they can live there, and the quality of life benefits are important. And there are still a lot of people who want to live out in suburbs, and the folks who do, I would just say that it's critical that you understand that suburbs are essentially tied to the cities that they're surround. I mean, I think that we're one economic unit. I remember during Hurricane Harvey, folks were talking about the Houston metro area. And
it's a sprawl.
It's a sprawl. It's bigger than the state of Connecticut, right? In other states, we would be a city. The whole state of Connecticut would be one city. And yet we think that each individual town is an island, and we don't have to worry about what happens 1 foot across the other side of that town line.
I think there are definite times, and I know this legislatively too, that there's a difference between urban and suburban. In the thought process that goes into budgeting, goes into legislation, and whereas you were pointing out before that when both sides of the aisle come together, which I like to point out for Connecticut is probably more than 90% of the time that both groups are working together. It's just you only hear around budget times
right.
when the differing points of view kind of come in to how things should be run. But it's important for us to be able to to be able to bring all those pieces together and realize, yeah, we are one community. I mean, I live in Milford. I'm right in between Bridgeport and New Haven.
Yeah.
And people, are going to go work in close proximity to one of those cities, or they're, going to go down to Stanford. And I think the more we build like our education system around the future of where we're going, which includes a lot of computer-oriented jobs, teaching kids how to code, like at a young age. I think coding should be like something that's taught as another language, like French or Spanish or other things along those lines, because those are the jobs that people, really, if you're going to grow companies, you're going to really need those kinds of people.
Right.
And I guess, I think of the big company down in Stanford that they just, it's not, the one that does the hiring. They do online hiring. What's the name of the company? I'm drawing a blank. I want to say it's Intuit, but it's not.
Apologies to your Stanford viewers.
Indeed.
Okay.
Yeah. They just added hundreds of jobs. Yeah. Most of those are for people that do programming and other things. Uh-huh. It's just, part of that is preparing people so that they can be able to, with minimal advanced education, be able to step into good jobs, and that's going to help keep people in our cities and keep them in Connecticut.
Yeah. And that's the trouble, right? We have a ton of companies that are hiring in Connecticut that are desperate to hire employers. We also have a lot of people who are looking for jobs, but we have a mismatch of the skills. And part of it is because we've got some of the best schools in the United States. I think overall we are, depending on how you count, third or fourth in education in terms of educational attainment, which is not the quality of our K through 12 schools, but the average amount of education that people have. We're, I think, something like second in the country. We're really high up there, but we've got a huge number of people who are going to substandard schools who don't have the skills that prepare them for jobs, and we're losing out, right? We can't attract businesses, we can't retain what we have if we don't have a pipeline that ensures that people are graduating from high school, college, graduate school with employable skills. And whether that's welding, because you're going to go work for EB or Pratt & Whitney or a supplier, or whether that's coding or some other marketable skill, we need to make sure that our educational system is there. And for a lot of people, particularly in some of our struggling towns out there, or struggling communities, we're not doing that. We're not doing a good enough job. And I think that's, whether you're Democrat or Republican, that's something that we need to pay an enormous amount of attention to.
Now, I guess one of the last things I wanted to kind of discuss, I know, because it's a lot of what I see going on, talking about. I know you're the secretary for Black and Puerto Rican Caucus, and you guys had a big rally going up at Hartford to talk about the situations like what's happening in Charlottesville, and also what's happening with immigrants and immigrant rights.
Sure.
I always look at you as you're one of those people that are usually at the forefront of all those things.
Yeah. So I mean, my grandmother was a refugee who escaped occupied Europe during the Nazis and World War II. Many of her members of her family were killed by the Nazis, and she survived narrow. And at the time, the United States wasn't open to refugees, and she went to the only place she could, which was Argentina in South America. And she married an Argentine man, and so my family's story is the story of both being from a refugee roots, but also strong appreciation for Argentina welcoming my grandmother, who's still alive, and my mother emigrated to this country, and is herself an immigrant. So when I see immigrants being subject to discrimination, to intimidation. When you see Nazis walking in American streets, that's just really upsetting to me, as it is to decent people all over the place. But I also think it's important that we recognize that wherever in the world your family comes from, we all came here one way or the other in search of a better life, except for Native Americans who were here to begin with, and African Americans whose families were generally brought here against their will. And so, but for those of us whose families chose to come here, it was because of a whole series of incentives, whether it's economic or just simply keeping your family alive. So,
yeah. I mean, I'm a direct immigrant. I came from the United Kingdom. I was lucky enough to, my father worked in technology that was well wanted, so we had an easier path to getting a green card. But I think of some of the immigrants that came in, and we're talking about DACA, deferred action. That wasn't their choice. I mean, they were brought with their families. Obviously, you go as a unit wherever your family goes. But here's a great resource that's been educated, that has started businesses, that have been paying into the system. Now that they can be able to get documentation and other things to be able to work. That if you put them back on an airplane or to wherever they came from, they're going to be completely lost. I couldn't go back to United Kingdom and really be able to just pick up like that.
Sure. Well, they couldn't come back because you'd have to cross the border or come in some other way. So they're actually, in most cases, have not been back to their home country. The average age that a DACA recipient came here was, I think, 6. So these are not, people who are choosing to violate immigration law. They're just being brought by their parents. When I look at my community, Middletown, Middletown is continuously benefited from immigration. 100 years ago, our population was down. We were losing population, and it was only immigrants from Ireland and Italy, and later from Poland, who kept our population growing, who wound up working in factories in Middletown and strengthening our economy, and now are huge anchors of our community. And our birth rate in this country has been down for a while. People are living longer. We need new workers to come in and pay for social services for our aging population. And if you look at Connecticut's demographics, we would be losing population over the last 20 years if it weren't for immigration. Immigration has really been incredibly important for our economy, and DACA recipients are actually much more likely than the general population to earn degrees, to have jobs. So they are. It seems like a no-brainer. They are helping support our economy in Connecticut, and frankly, we need more young people in this state, not fewer. And if these are folks who are getting degrees and paying taxes and earning jobs, that's fantastic. And that's to me, I find the president's behavior on this sort of puzzling, because it doesn't seem to make any side. It doesn't help anybody in this country. It just simply makes the situation more dangerous, more fraught, and it hurts our economy.
Well, and it hurts those communities too, because when you take that away, it makes people afraid to report crimes and do other things along those lines, or even, it promotes people driving without insurance and other things along those lines that, people are going to go do no matter what, because they have to be able to get around and other things along those lines, and they get taken advantage of, and it hurts our communities in the long run.
Absolutely.
And I know I'm down to the last couple of minutes. Sure. I know you're not running for Secretary of State, but I'm sure you're probably going to be either running for representative or something along those lines. So I just wanted to give you a couple minutes to talk to your constituents, whoever they may be.
Well, look, thank you. Yeah, right now I don't know what I'm doing. I made a promise to Denise Merrill
Yep.
that I would only run for Secretary of the State if she didn't. She's since announced that she is currently running, and so I intend to keep my word. I think the thing that constituents expect from politicians more than anything else is that they keep their promises, and that's something
Yes.
that I think is really important. The state has a lot of challenges, right? I think that it's very clear that Connecticut has lagged the country the last 20 years in terms of economic growth, but we're also doing a lot of things really well. We've got one of the healthiest populations in the country. Our healthcare system, I think, is the second best in the country. We talked about how educated people are. We have still tons of major employers that are doing well. We've got startups that are doing well. We've increased the number of billionaires who lived here over the last few years. Connecticut is a desirable place because it's got wonderful communities that people like to live in. But we got fiscal challenges, and we got to jumpstart our economy. And as a Democrat, I think it's important that the Democratic Party talks about creating an economy that works for everyone, where you don't have to be the son of a billionaire to make it. That whether you live in Derby or Milford or New Haven or New London, that you can work hard, you can get a good education, and you can go to college that you can afford. And I think we need to figure out how to articulate an economic message to voters that says that we care about people, that we have a realistic plan to strengthen the economy in this state. So I'll be finding ways to support people to help build infrastructure at the local level. I think what you're doing in Milford is so critical because when people actually, we talk an awful lot about what the president does and what Congress does, but the government that actually affects people's lives is on the state level and on the local level. And so
It's where the rubber hits the road, and that's really where it is.
that's a good tagline for Street Talk. So I'm going to be supporting a lot of local folks, and I think that's really the where things matter. So I'm going to be doing.
Well, I thank you very much for coming out here.
Thank you, Dominic.
I know we went a couple minutes over, but I'm sure everybody's all right with that. So I look forward to seeing you next week. We have Representative Chris Rosario coming on, as well as some other local politicians coming on. So I guess we can go run the street.